In this video, we're going to go through the structure of a basic function. So the basic structure looks something like this. The first part is visibility. And visibility is going to be kind of the access modifiers. And there's a couple different options here. There's actually four, but we're going to deal with two mainly in this class. The two that we're going to deal with are public and private. And this is actually how the code is kind of hidden or shown for other pieces of code in the actual same program. So public is probably the least protected out of all of them. And it itself can be accessed by any other code in the same solution or anything else that refers to it. So you can actually, it's fairly open. On the flip side of things, we have private. And private is going to be the most restricted, and it can only be accessed by code in the same class, which is basically kind of like the same file that we're actually using. So we'll go through that as well. There also is a thing called protected and internal, which you'll learn about in your future courses, but we're not going to cover right here. Also, one more thing about the visibility and access modifiers. We have another thing called static. And this is another modifier that comes after the public or private, and it can be applied to a method or a class. And when it is, the only thing you have to worry about is you always have to make them all match. So because our main method that we've been using is a static method, then our methods have to have that static keyword with them as well. So the next thing up there is the return type. And the return type can be any type, data type that we're actually going to be returning into our code. But the thing is, it has to match the return value. And I'm going to make a whole entire separate video on this. But the main thing I want you to know from this is if we don't return anything, then we still have to use the keyword of void. And you can kind of think of it like in the English language, a void means nothing. Right? So same thing in programming language. Anytime you see the word void, that basically means nothing. So if our actual method or function doesn't return anything, then we still use void right there. Then we have the function name. And the function name is kind of a lot like the naming convention for variables. So it has to start with a capital letter. It cannot contain spaces, but you can use camel casing to make it easier to read, which is where you capitalize the first letter of every word. You can also use underscores, but we kind of want to go towards camel casing because that's the industry standard right now. And it should always be descriptive to what the actual function does. Because remember, a function usually has one specific task. So you want to name the name of the function something very descriptive to that task as well. So then we have open and closing parentheses. And inside of there, we put something called parameters. And parameters are going to have their own video as well. But we can leave this blank if nothing is being passed into our method or our function. So for right now, we're just going to leave it blank until we actually watch the video about parameters and arguments. So after parameters, then we have the open and closing curly brackets, and we can put all of our code inside of there, and that is going to be the block of code that will run every single time we call the function. So what am I even calling the function? Well, a function call is actually how we get it to actually run. And what we do is we type out in our main method the name of the function, and then an open and closing parentheses. And if we have any arguments, then we're going to put the arguments in there. And again, we're going to make a whole separate video about arguments and parameters, but very simply and very quickly, arguments are going to be the values that are passed into the function. And here's where we're going to begin. Now, this is going to be the weird part because up until this video, we have always worked inside of our main method. And now we know a little bit more about it actually, because we know that this is the visibility one, which is going to be the access modifier, and it's public, so that means it's the most visible and everybody can actually see it. And then we have the static keyword, and the static is going to be used when things aren't changing, right? Because think of the English word static, that means no motion. So this is what happens, this is what we're going to be using when something doesn't change. So the main method never really changes because it's always the main method, so that's why it's going to be a static method. Then we have void because it actually doesn't return anything. The name of it is main because the main method is always launched. And then inside of it we have the parameters, and I'll explain the parameters in a separate video. So for right now, what I want to do is I actually want to go outside of our main method, but still inside of our class, main class. So I want to go to this closing curly bracket and hit enter a couple times. So we make sure we have two down here, the closing curly brackets, and then in between that one. So this one closes that, this one closes that. Okay? So once we're down inside of here, we can actually make our own method. And so let's walk through the steps of this. So first things first is we need that access modifier. And for this, we're going to go ahead and call it public. So we're going to use lowercase public, and then a space. Static, because our main method is static, so our methods have to be static. This one is not going to return anything yet because we haven't really covered returns. So if we're not going to return anything, we just use the keyword of void. And then we can actually have the name of our function. And what we're going to do is we just want to print something to the console. So I'm just going to go ahead and call this one, let's say, print name. And then we have the open and closing parentheses. And this is where parameters will go, but right now we don't have any. So again, I'll cover that in a future video. Then we have an open and closing curly brackets, and I'm going to split those apart. So inside of here is going to be the code that will run when I call, and I'm going to put call like this, call this method. So all I really wanted to do is just do a console.writeLine, open close, semicolon, inside of it, just say welcome, and I'm going to put my own name in. So welcome Dan to the program. Now the interesting thing about this is I have written out our code and I've stored it inside of the method called printName. Now if I try to run my code, nothing shows up in our console and we don't get any errors. But the problem is we have not actually run our method because we have never called it. So I talked very briefly about how functions are kind of like a factory. You can think of a function call as kind of like the on button for the factory. So the factory will just sit there and not do anything until you press the on button, and then the factory will start moving and it'll start doing everything it's supposed to do, and it will actually spit out what it's supposed to spit out. So back in our main method, we're going to come over here and we are going to create a function call for our printName method. So really a function call is just going to be the name of our method, which is printName, and followed by an open and closing parentheses and a semicolon. So let's go ahead and try it. So I'm going to start typing out printName, and look at that, it already pops up because it knows that it's a method that we created. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, open closing parentheses and a semicolon, and now what happens when I actually run the program? Welcome Dan to the program. So right there, welcome Dan. So what happens is our main method executes, it goes into line 9, it kind of ignores our comment, it gets down to line 10, and as soon as it activates this, it basically starts our main method. So the sequential order stops here for a moment, jumps down all the way inside of our method, executes everything inside these curly brackets, which right now is just a console.writeLine. When it comes to the ending closing curly bracket, it jumps right back up here, and then it will continue right to the next of its code. So what happens if I put something above it? So I'm going to go ahead and close this real quick. And I'm going to come above in our main method, and I'm going to put a console.writeLine, open closing and a semicolon inside of here a text string, and I'm going to put before the function call, and then after it I'm going to put a console.writeLine, open closing parentheses and a semicolon, and I'm just going to put a text string of after the function call. So now when I run it, you'll see we have before the function call. Then, as soon as it runs the printName method, it jumps down and then types out the welcome Dan to the program, hits the closing curly bracket, jumps right back up to this line, and then executes line 12, which is the after the function call line. So that's kind of the basic premise of a basic function. Now, you can also call it as many times as you want. For example, what if I put after the function call write line, print name, open close, and a semicolon again. And then I run it. Notice I get before the function call, welcome Dan to the program, after the function call, and welcome Dan to the program. So what happens is it comes into our main method, executes this line, which is before the function call, right here. Then it executes the function, so it jumps down inside the function and executes line number 22, which types that welcome Dan to the program. After that, it comes right back up and then does the line number 12, which is the after the function call write line. Comes down to 14, it jumps back down to line number 22 and does it again. So the great thing about a function is we can use it over and over again as many times as we want. We can also have as many functions as we want. So I'm going to come back inside of our main class. So I'm going to highlight the first one just to make sure I know where that closing curly bracket is. And I'm going to come right before it and just hit enter a couple times just so I can see it spaced out. Now I'm going to create a new method that's just going to print something else. So I'm going to call it public again. That's the access modifier. Static, because we have to make sure it's static because our main method is static. Void, because it's not going to return anything. And let's name it maybe print more. Open closing parentheses. I'm going to hit enter, open closing curly bracket, and split those apart. And inside of here, I'm just going to do a console.writeLine again. And I'm going to put a text string of, I hope you enjoy the program. Okay, so that right there is a complete method. An access modifier, which is the public, the static as well, that's a modifier. Then we have the return type is void because we're not returning anything. The name of the method, open closing parentheses, which will eventually contain our parameters, open closing curly brackets, which contains our code that we want to run, and that's about it. So if I run it now, will I see it? And the answer is no, right? Because I have not called it. So a function or a method, you can put as many as you want, but before you actually call it, it actually won't run. So I'm going to come back up here and I'm going to run it the last thing. So I'm going to come all the way down here to line number 15, and I'm going to go ahead and type out print more, open closing, and a semicolon. And I'm going to go right before it and just say this is the function call or go button to start our method. So when I run it, we have, I hope you enjoy the program, the very last thing. So again, it'll run line number 9, go to line number 11, jump down to line number 24, back up to line 11, then run line number 12, then run line number 14, hard to say, run line number 14, and then as soon as it runs line number 14, it'll jump down to line number 24 again, and that's where we get the welcome Dan to the program, the second one. Come back up to line number 14, it goes to line number 16, and that function call jumps all the way down to here, which is line number 32, executes line number 32, comes to the closing curly bracket, jumps back up to line number 16, and finally we come to the closing curly bracket of our main method, which actually is the end of our program.